Hello and welcome to What Would Jane Do, the podcast that takes a light-hearted look at the early 19th century solutions filtered through the mind of Jane Austen, born to come to bear on 21st century problems. And my name is Julia Golding. I'm an author and a great admirer of Jane Austen. And I've also written a series of children's books inspired by Jane Austen herself, which we'll come to a bit later on. And I'm delighted to say that joining us for coming to join our company today is Mrs. Catherine McFarlane, Katie McFarlane, who is looking resplendent, if you are following this on YouTube, in her outfit. So Katie, tell us a little bit about how you're dressed and maybe why you're dressed like that, because that's the big thing about today and our podcast.
Well, it's interesting you should ask, Julia, but this is my homage to Jane Austen, as I do every time we have a podcast, I admit. Yeah. But this particularly today is to do with Pride and Prejudice. So I'm wearing, it's interesting, isn't it? We're talking about first impressions. Mm-hmm. And one of the interesting things about Jane Austen is we have no first impressions really of her. There's no attributed portrait, although I think there's one that's supposed to be the back of her, and several quite dubious ones that have been lost in translation, as it were. But there's no actual portrait, so we never know exactly how Jane Austen actually looks. So we can speculate, of course, and we can go on very vague descriptions from her family. But anyway, she's often portrayed for marketing purposes as somebody with a mob cap on and a simple blue gown. So that's what I'm wearing today. I'm also wearing, after our controversial to do with bonnets in film, I'm wearing my Lizzie Bennet bonnet. This is my latest bonnet in a series of bonnets. This one's from Hat's Period. And if I take it off, give you sorry for those of you listening at home, I'll just have to describe it. It's a chipped straw bonnet, and it's got little rosettes of blue silk and lovely thick ribbon to tie it on with. It's amazingly comfortable to wear. It frames my face, and I couldn't resist it at the reenactors market I went to when I saw this, because it is just a lovely, simple design.
It is absolutely gorgeous and very practical, because yes. We've got out of the habit. Well, actually, I wear hats all the time, particularly in winter. I'm a great hat wearer, but you can see it keeping the sun off, the glare out of your eyes.
That's what I say, and that's why I often wear a bergère when I'm reenacting, because it's my 18th century sunshades, as I call it, because it protects your face. It stops you getting too brown if you are.
I just go red. I just go red, so it stops me going red and horrible.
Well, I do too, and I've got very pale eyes, so I'm very sensitive to light. So having a shade is a necessity for me, definitely.
So we've mentioned that we are talking about first impressions and Pride and Prejudice, and that's because we're recording this on the 28th of January, which is happily the publication anniversary of Pride and Prejudice. So we are 210 years away from the moment that book first came and hit the shelves. So I always like thinking of Pride and Prejudice as a winter book, because apparently January is the lowest moment of the year for many people. In the UK, it's when we pay our taxes. I'm sure that probably is true around the world. And so cheering us up with a bit of astute romantic shenanigans is Jane Austen. So Katie, what was your before we talk about first impressions, what was your first impression of Pride and Prejudice when you first read it?
Well, I think I was probably about 12, and that's quite interesting, because Jane Austen's formal education finished when she was about 12. After that, she was taken out of school and was presumably supposed to be helping her family with various tasks and things like that, but she never stopped reading herself, and she basically raided the libraries of her family and friends, and that was her education, if you like. So I wasn't made to read Jane Austen. I just came across a complete works in very, very tiny print, it has to be said, of Jane Austen on my family shelves, and thought, oh, this looks quite interesting, and just studiously read my way through the books, but for fun, not because
Did you
anyone
find
forced
it
me.
difficult to read?
It took a while to get into the language. It's almost like not reading a foreign language particularly, but you need to get it like reading Shakespeare. You need to get into the rhythm of the language, but it's very easy to do if you just focus. And I was thinking back to first impressions today and wondering how many children today would have the focus necessary to immerse themselves in a book. And I think one of my cousin's children made a very sad comment when my mother said, "Oh, what books do you like?" She said, "Oh, we're modern teenagers. We don't read. It's all split-second TikToks and 40-second exposures to each other." And they're actually, I think, today children are losing the ability to concentrate for very long on anything at all because the entertainment is all so fast and furious.
Yes, so I think it's like training. So it's never too late to get off the sofa and start to do the half marathon.
Yes.
And I think that this is the thing about Jane Austen. I've actually been doing a whole series of BBC radio interviews for local radio this week. I've done about 5 or 6 by now. And talking, to Somerset and Leeds and London, all sorts of places. And it's varied. I've noticed that if I've got a female presenter interviewing me, they've always been a fan. And if it's a male presenter, one of their questions is, "Oh, isn't it too difficult for children to read Jane Austen?"
You see, that comment makes me very angry.
Yeah,
as a reader, because nothing is too difficult for children. I think limiting them in that way, saying this is a children's book, so this is what you should read, or this is, just, I don't know, saying this is a lady's book, so this is what you should read. And they did that to Jane Austen in her time as well. Don't read anything too complicated for your poor little brains. This is improving literature. This is what you should read. And it's
that's so funny. That's just brilliant. I hadn't thought of it in that connection.
Yes.
It's equivalent of saying they can only read Fordyce's sermons.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah, you're right. And I don't. So yes, it is difficult to tune yourself in, but I'm sure children master much more difficult things. Of course they do.
And what you tend to find, like anything, is you read a language and maybe you're not sure of half of the words, but you get the general gist of the thing. And my parents were very good taking me at a young age to cultural things like Shakespeare plays, and they would just explain the basic story to me before I went.
Yeah.
But even though I didn't understand maybe half at the time of the language, I knew where it was going roughly, and I knew the fact that you were listening to it spoken as opposed to read made a lot more sense.
So one of the reasons why I've written a series of children's books, which the Jane Austen Investigates series, is to help children understand the context. I use a bit of, they're speaking in appropriately, not saying okay and cool, and they're speaking appropriately, appropriate language, but accessible language. So the idea is, if you can read that, then you're ready to read Jane Austen. And I'm hoping that that's a gateway. It's a gateway drug to Jane Austen, Class A drug.
Absolutely.
Right. So before we go, let's now turn to first impressions. And we, as ever, our sort of structure is we're going to first of all think what that meant in Jane's time. And then we're going to think of our modern equivalents and draw on Jane's wisdom. So really, first impressions now means, what do you think? It's like when you first meet someone, what's your first impression? And here in our era, I think it's more muddled because we're a more diverse population. Back in, let's say, 1800, let's take that as our date. Jane Austen lived in a world where lots of people lived in smaller communities where everybody was known. And you can see this in her novels. So when Mr. Bingley and his party walk into the assembly room, everyone knows. They say, "Oh, he's got 5,000 a year. He's got 10,000 a year."
And they've been speculating about them for weeks before they arrive as well, haven't they?
Their spies have been out in the community. They've talked to the servants. They've found out the info, maybe from the person who let the hall to them, the local lawyer or whatever. There was a great local gossip circle. So when they walk in, the first impression is a socio-economic one. So it's where they fit. And we also are aware that the Bingleys are from a newer source of money, and Mr. Darcy is from an older source of money, so he gets, you know, the kudos for being, I know he hasn't got, interestingly he isn't ennobled, and Jane Austen, it's interesting she doesn't go that route, because other novels in the period would have made him Sir somebody or Lord somebody, but
yes,
she doesn't.
It is interesting that she
almost
deliberately strays away from that. I don't know whether it would make him too unattainable or
possibly
just...
and also maybe she felt she didn't actually really know that world.
No, exactly, and that was a very wise move on her part, I think. Yes.
So I think that there is parallels. We might be able to judge, not always, but we can often judge people's rough economic status by what car they drive. Of course, it could be like they owe lots of money to lots of people. If they wear a Rolex, if they wear designer clothes, Wickham, you know, it's that thing. And so the Bingley women are dressed in the top fashions. The local ladies are, you know, making over their dresses and retrimming them, turning them, occasionally getting a new one, you know. So they would be aware of each other's social sort of money. I think that the thing about money is mixed up with awareness of class. So why don't you have a stab at what you understand as the layers in society in Jane's time? Because you must come across this in your reenactment.
I do, and it's always really interesting to me, because you can be anybody you want to in reenacting. That's the joy of it.
Yeah.
If, well, like me, you're a bit of a slob and a t-shirt and jeans girl in your other life, you can dress up a bit and be a lady. But what I quickly found out when I do that is that I am separated from the soldiers I reenact with, because a lady would not hang around a redcoat camp. Never mind if you're Lydia or Kitty. Not done. Why? I need a reason to be there. So maybe I'd be visiting my officer husband, and that's perfectly acceptable. But you wouldn't just turn up at a soldier's camp as a lady and hang around. Your reputation would be in shreds very quickly. So I often go off and paint or draw or talk to the public, obviously, go into rooms and read, you know, do something of a lady's occupation, possibly, that also enables me to talk to people. So that's why I very quickly became a woman of the camp, and to give me a good reason to be there. And also I can help the soldiers. I can't gather wood, mind the fire, chop up things that are messy if I'm wearing a lady's outfit. Just walking around a garden, you're going to get dirty. So we're very quickly made aware that if you're wearing a beautiful outfit, there's very little you can do in that outfit. So again, that's symbolic of your social importance of, I'm wearing such beautiful clothes, there is no way I need to earn my living manually. Because anyone who realizes just how difficult and labor intensive getting through an ordinary person's day will very quickly realize there's a reason that Jane Austen would have had a load of aprons to cover her clothes, doing dirty tasks and things like that. And you keep your clothes as clean as you can, but the whole reason of having layers is you have a protective outer layer that you can then remove, and you have a protective underlayer, like your chemise or something. So again, you can wash that, but your dress, your main dress that you have to keep going for many years, is protected. But if you are a high status person, of course, you can afford many more outfits than a middle or lower class person can. And that's why so many lower class outfits don't survive and the higher class ones do, because the lower class ones would have not only been worn to death and remade, but once they became rags, the rags would have been used. So there are very, very few lower class outfits left existing. But luckily, we have a lot of prints and pictures, obviously, to tell us what during the day.
Yeah. And one just little thing to clear up for everybody. Trousers were worn by working class people, like men. Yes. Like they were baggy outfits. I was just reading today about I'm very interested in the naval economics of the era, and they tried to ban laborers wearing trousers in naval shipyards because they were smuggling out up down the trouser leg, smuggling out sort of bits of wood and bolts and what have you. it didn't work because that was the clothes the labourers had to wear, and
course.
breeches were an upper class thing. So,
Mm.
not just upper
naval
class.
people had very loose trousers to
Yeah.
enable them to move around, and again to cover under trousers and things like that. So it would have been quite easy to smuggle stuff in there. And ladies, again, have been taken up at this time with their pockets. So you could, there's a wonderful book, I think, called The Pocket, a sort of social history of women's revolution, if you like, through wearing pockets. And the pockets, of course, you could wear outside your garment, but most often it would be a pocket through a slit in your skirt, and you could have all sorts of interesting things. So there's very interesting records of the period showing when people lost their pockets, or did they? Were they actually cut purse by a thief? How they'd get under your garments, I'm not quite sure, but somehow. But what they found in pockets were not just things like handkerchiefs, keys, money, obviously. People have been smuggling things like ducks, food, lace. Jane Austen's relative was taken up, wasn't she? I think Mrs.
Yes.
Over a controversy as to whether she'd stolen some lace or not.
That's right.
But and today, again, to our ears, well, it's just a bit of lace, isn't it? Well, if you know real lace, how long it takes to create, especially a fine bit, that's months of work and skilled work at that. So she was stealing hundreds of pounds worth of goods by our reckoning.
So this is so to our theme. This is actually quite a warning. First impressions, you may look very lovely in your dress, but maybe underneath that you've got a duck.
Are you smuggling?
Are you smuggling a duck?
What has it got in its pockets?
Yes.
Find another favourite author.
So let's just, for those who aren't familiar, lucky them, with the English class system, go through where they are, and we'll put the people in Pride and Prejudice, we'll slot them in.
Okay.
So at the very top of society is obviously the royal family.
Yes.
And those
are numerous, aren't they, Julia?
Yeah. We won't name them all, but they're at the top of the family. And then you've got the nobility, who are your dukes and your viscounts and so on. And you've got sort of around that, you've got in London the ton. Now, if you watch Bridgerton, you'll know what the ton is. It's the group of people who go dancing with each other and who flirt with each other.
Is it the upper 10,000 or the upper?
Yeah. So it's like the upper. They're not all nobles, but they're all moneyed, and known. And then it merges from the nobility into the gentry. Oh, so so someone like Lady Catherine de Bourgh makes it into that. Yes. Darcy probably does too.
Yeah, by association.
Maybe Mr. Bingley on a good day. He would be sort of.
He'd be accepted to keep the numbers up.
And if Darcy invites him, he would be allowed in.
Yes.
Yeah. You must excuse me. I've got a bit of a cold. If you're watching this, you'll see I'm struggling with a cold here.
Oh.
Anyway, so going down from that. At least I'm not coughing like Kitty. Going down from that, you've got the gentry. Now, a gentry is a Sir Somebody. It's that level.
And squire of the local, so that they'd probably be more.
The local squire. It's the Sir William Lucas.
Yes,
it's that level of society. Yeah. So you're the big man or big lady in your local society.
Yeah.
So that's probably the kind of titled person that Jane Austen most often met, with the exception of her brother who was adopted. That's another story. But anyway, so that's the sort of commoner garden important person.
Yeah.
And then below that, you've got the rising, and they may overlap because some of these sirs were people who came out of being good businessmen.
Yes.
And were rewarded with the title. So you've got the rich people coming up because they're doing well in the early industrial revolution. So they might be merchants, they might be people going to the navy. That was a massive thing. If you supplied the navy with timber or iron or copper or any of these things, hemp, all sorts of stuff, that's one way of making money. It's a wartime, so
there are fortunes to be made.
There are fortunes to be made. Supplies for the army and navy.
Yes.
The potteries, Wedgwood. So if you're in that group, you're rising, and you're rich. And you're probably going to be noble by the time you get to being in the Victorian era. So that's that class going that way. Then we're still talking about only a sort of small part of society, even so, the moneyed part. And then you've got roughly the middling classes. And I don't think they call them middle class, they'd call them middling, wouldn't they?
Yes.
And that is your rector, your
educated people, but
school
not
teacher,
with not much money.
your lawyer,
Yes.
Your land steward. They're professional people who aren't sort of sweating it out in the fields. And actually, some larger farmers would make it into that group,
absolutely.
well-to-do farmers.
Gentlemen farmers, yeah.
And sort of in a sort of joining this group, but slightly to one side, are the servants. Huge numbers of people in society are serving the other folk. And if you are a butler in charge of a large household, you're an important person.
Yeah, again, you are a large person in your little world.
Yeah.
So you had enormous power over a small bunch of people and were expected to manage them. So you were upper management if you were thinking firm.
So we're now coming into sort of the massed ranks. So Mr. Bennet, for example, is a middling kind of person.
Yes.
He's on the upper end of that because of his life of leisure, but that's where he fits. Daughter of a gentleman, they're called, aren't they? The Bennet sisters.
And as Lizzie herself says, you are a gentleman's son, I'm a gentleman's daughter. In that way, we are equal.
She's trying to collapse social distinctions, which was quite revolutionary. Well, to discuss, that's one way of looking at society. And we need to now go and cover everybody else. So you've got labourers. Now, a lot of servants are labourers. So Mrs. Hill and that lot are just kind of your ordinary labouring people. We haven't quite got to the working class politics yet. That seems more of a terminology going along with Marxism later on, but they are the labouring classes. You've got loads of people working on the land, shepherds, people,
and then of course loads of people employed
hedges.
by the military at this time.
Yes, I was going to do the military they're like servant class. They were sort of slightly
in our beehive.
But you've got a new industrial working class coming up. You've got miners, you've got people working in factories. Water power was reaching its sort of height of what it was doing. It was used in forging metals, it was used in cotton, so they were using water power technology. And you get big factories like at New Lanark near Glasgow. So it's the beginning of that kind of world, which is much more familiar in Victorian period. And then you've got, as you say, you've got the military, we're at war. You've got lots of people in the Navy and the merchant Navy, men, I should say, in this case, with a few ladies, women, not ladies, hanging on. And that's obviously necessary in war. And then below all of that, you've got the sort of widows and orphans and the indigent and the vagrants. And the tramps and the people who don't fit in society, like the sort of gypsy classes, those sorts of things. I don't know how many of those there were, but I suspect of the poor there was an awful lot, as ever. So that's how it looked. It's the typical pyramid, and Jane Austen's world sits in the middle and the top level of the labouring classes. You don't meet many people below that. I can't think of a character.
No, and it's interesting that I think a lot of people's perceptions of Jane Austen was she was upper middle class, but I think in reality she was definitely more middle class, teetering on the brink of poverty at times. She was elevated sometimes by her brother, who basically got lucky and got adopted by a rich family, so he helped her out. But her brothers all worked, and I think the other brother took over her father's curacy, didn't he? But she herself earned very little during her lifetime. I think it's estimated about £800 in total she ever saw for her books. And they weren't really all that. I mean, they were very popular amongst certain circles, but they were nothing like as popular as they are now. So I think her popularity definitely came after her death and more people embraced them. But
they didn't have
middle classes,
They didn't have a royalty system.
No.
So she sold her books for a lump sum.
That was it.
And also just to mention, there is a particular problem for women, as you're saying, there are limited roles if you were an educated woman for earning your own
Very
living,
limited. Yeah.
And if you were doing something like being a seamstress, that's terrible work. Obviously, being a mother is a massive job.
Yes.
Huge. Lots of people were doing that. Why not? Society has to carry on. And then, of course, loads and loads of prostitutes. People. So, first impressions. Most people could pigeonhole somebody when they walked in a room where they fitted in society. So, partly because you knew them, but even if you didn't know them, you could look for certain clues that told you where they fitted, like accent, what they wore, what they ate, how they spoke, their manners, that kind of thing.
Yes.
So another first impression was about religion, because I don't think we've talked about religion in Jane Austen.
Not a lot.
Because obviously the predominant faith was the Church of England in her part of the world. But at the time there were lots of other sorts of Christian religions. There were the nonconformists, Methodists,
Quakers,
and so on.
Wesleyans.
Yeah, and also Catholics, of course. And there were laws against to protect. It's partly coming out of the wars of religion, as you all know, but there were laws about Catholics holding certain roles in society, not being able to go to the universities and things like that. So, and a lot of the Catholics, follow me here, come from Ireland. So if someone had an Irish accent that was from Southern Ireland, not Northern Ireland, you might guess at them being Catholic. And there were some well-known big families who were Catholic. So there was, and in Scotland, of course, there was has a Protestant Catholic thing going on too. So that division is in society, that you might have a first impression, oh, you're a Catholic, which was immediately putting them outside of society with the big S, the ton kind of society.
Yes. It was a disadvantage, wasn't it?
Yeah, it was.
Like Tom Lefroy, my Irish friend. Yes, that he was impoverished. Well, not impoverished, but he was certainly held back, shall we say, by his Irish connections when Jane met him.
There were very few people who were outside of that particular. So there are not many. If you're, say, a Muslim or Hindu or something, you're probably an overseas visitor, or Jewish. You could well be from a traditional Jewish family, but you would be regarded as, I don't know, an exotic minority.
Well, you can see how Shakespeare treated Shylock way back in Elizabethan times. Jewish people were already getting a lot of prejudice and caricature because, and I think that sort of thing arises because people don't know many of whoever's being lampooned. So it's easy to make people into caricatures if you don't know that type of person. Whereas if you live amongst them, you're going to question it and say, well, why are you portraying this person in this way? That's not what they're like.
So there definitely would have been people of other religions within society, particularly in London and places places with docks like Bristol and Liverpool, but not within Jane's little circle. She's unlikely to have met many people. Of course, if you travel to India, as many of her relatives did, then of course your experience is much more opened up. But just thinking about Jane's first impressions and what her society did, and I think someone coming in of another religion would be of real interest to the sort of Meriton society.
She had that French that relative who escaped the revolution. That would have been a nice exotic person, and I think her relative is later held up to be the model for Mary Crawford, possibly.
Yeah, she marries one of her brothers.
Yeah, she marries one of her brothers.
Her name will come to me in a minute.
Person coming from a foreign land who's had an exciting lifestyle. So that would have been quite an injection of romance into her life.
Yes, but she would have been. I think she was a conventional C of E person once she got here. Yeah. I'm blanking on her name. I do normally know it. Anyway. Okay, so we're going through our first impression. So if I'm looking at someone walking into a ballroom, I might think, oh, you're such and such in society. This is your religion. Because I'm going to put myself amongst all the biddies, gossiping away. That's where I am. Yeah. Also, which nation of Great Britain you come from, Welsh,
Yeah.
Scottish, Irish,
Yeah.
and also which country, which county, because we're for those of you listening from abroad, England itself has loads of different accents. Kate and I are sort of talking in a close to
I actually call it a middle class accent.
Yeah, we're in a kind of
Whether that's
RP
true
world.
or not is anyone's guess.
But if I was talking to someone from Cornwall or somebody from
yes,
up north somewhere, you'd hear quite a difference in how we how we speak, and we would know where we were from. And then I think what the last thing that I want to just mention on the first impressions is the society in the town versus the society in the country. So there's that scene in Pride and Prejudice where Mrs. Bennet, Mr. Darcy is asked if he enjoys the country, and he sort of talks about town and about the limited society in the country, and Mrs. Bennet sort of slaps back, but unfortunately in the slapping back hits herself really, because she then goes, oh well, we dine with at least, I can't remember how many,
20 families a week.
Yes, something like that. Also some sort of 3 or 4 pairs of families, which compared to this, you get the idea that London is full of socializing and much wider group of people you call on. So she's showing her ignorance. So there is the country mouse, city mouse first impressions going on there as well. Not that you think Mr. Darcy particularly enjoys the social scene in London. I don't know why he said that really, but I always think he'd be much happier up in Pemberley in his library with his book, striding out across the fields.
Yes, I mean, if you think about it, I enjoy going out and socializing like anyone. But as I'm a great advocate of my favorite Jane Austen quote, there's nothing like staying at home for real comfort.
Yeah, exactly.
I think all of us are possibly happiest when we've got our feet up, a good book and a nice cup of tea or something, and we're at home, we're safe, we're comfortable, everything is to our liking and ordered like Mr. Woodhouse would have it. He's got his own little world and he's directed it to be exactly as he pleases. Who wouldn't like that? So going out into the world can be quite a scary experience for people who are more introverted.
Yeah,
people like Jane Austen would probably be a bit of both. I think she moved in quite a small society, but she was documented as going out and enjoying larger society as well.
Yes, they're all in lockdown, aren't they?
Yes.
So just to ask about social mobility, I've got a few things to say about that, but did first impressions stop you being socially mobile at this era?
I don't know if your first impressions were definitely very important and set your status amongst your peers. I think it was a very hard thing to move from one status to another status. You had people who were apprenticed and could maybe move up through a business. You had sailors like Captain Wentworth, who started off quite impoverished, but through winning prize money, achieved great social status and was suddenly much more of a catch for later on in life. But it's quite hard to be allowed to move through the social strata. I think certainly the haves would not want too many have-nots mingling with them, and that's why there's a ridiculous amount of social rules that are understood and you are raised to know them from birth if you're in the upper echelons of English society. And I think it was something like just something as simple as being introduced to somebody. And if you say, how do you do in response to, how do you do? How do you do? You respond. And if you don't respond, how do you do? Or you respond in a more casual way, you're instantly, oh, right, you haven't passed the test. I know which social strata you belong to now, and it's not mine.
So, well, of course, poor Mr. Collins.
Yes, trying to ingratiate himself.
He introduces himself to Darcy.
And that's the thing, that at the time, anyone reading the book would have just winced in horror at somebody introducing themselves without being introduced. And Sir William, doesn't he, introduces Mr. Darcy to Lizzie as a very desirable dancing partner. And that's the thing. And again, it's about protecting your social well-being, if you like. You wouldn't just go up to somebody and introduce yourself. You would wait for someone of similar social status to introduce this person to you as a safe person to know. We're not rocking the boat here. This is someone who's safe. I can vouch for him. And it was very, very important to get introductions into society if you wanted to get ahead. You needed to know, and you still, I would argue, need to know the right people to get into certain clubs, to get into certain businesses. There is an under society, if you like, of hidden groups of people who are all there to help each other. And there always has been, because it makes sense if you want to keep your social standing. But it was definitely a thing at the time that as Kitty and Lydia, rushing up to hobnob with the officers, were definitely pushing things a bit. They were behaving in a very forward manner.
Yes, so on the social mobility point, outside of Jane Austen's novels, I think there were places you could be socially mobile. One was through, we mentioned, being a very good businessman, so getting money, so that you were lending money to the government,
to the Prince Regent,
and to the Prince Regent, yeah, so that you were rewarded for that, and you were given, your titles and your.
But they do that today. How many businessmen today suddenly become lords and ladies through lending money to politicians?
And to be honest, it's been going on all the time prior to that. But because the ability to make money was widening out into industrial areas, you were getting a new kind of person making money. The other way of making your way up the social sort of ladder was in the Navy, because if you were in the military, you had to buy your commission. It's expensive.
Yes.
In the Navy, the way that worked is it was the place where second and third sons could go, and if they were lucky with how they ran their naval career, they could
rise through the
enemy vessels, get some prize money. Prize money means you get a proportion of the value of the vessel and the goods that the vessel was carrying.
The higher up the social scale you are, like a captain, would get the majority of the prize money, and then the rest would be filtered down through the rest of the ship.
So Jane's own brothers, you've got Frank, who does very well out of the Navy, and Charles, who doesn't do, he's not as lucky, he gets shipwrecked, in fact. So that's another way of rising up through society. But I think there is a ceiling. So even somebody like George Canning, who becomes a very important government minister, and has all the connections you could imagine, his mother was an actress, and he was never allowed to forget it. So there is this sort of unpleasant sort of snobbery.
Yes, and prejudice.
A lot of the new people were making their own connections, so they had their own importance within their own group. So you've got the new people like the Lunar Society, who were like the scientists of the day, the ones who invented the
Herschel and things like that.
Yeah, they had their own clubs, partly because they weren't being in the other clubs, and maybe they didn't want to spend time with these folk anyway.
Yes.
So that's first impressions. Let's think about what Jane makes of social status. We've talked about some of this, but first of all, where we started with money, I think she doesn't diss money. She thinks it's very useful, and she's very practical about this.
Yes, she knows it's a necessary evil. I mean, there's a reason why money, as we've said before, is a romantic trope. There's a reason why all these romance novels how many romance novels can we find if we looked on shelves in booksellers at the moment that had the Duke says this, the Earl says this, the Earl's Bride. And I think the reason why titles are so often seen as a romantic must-have is because of the money and the prestige that goes with them.
Yeah.
So would you buy a book and the romance, because it's something that most of us don't understand. It's a foreign exotic thing, isn't it? So there's this perception of dukes and earls being wonderfully romantic, but I think if you've ever met a duke or an earl, and I've seen some from a distance, they're just ordinary people like the rest of us.
Yeah.
They were just trying to get by as best they can, like the rest of us.
Unfortunately,
they happen
not.
to have a bigger house, but it's more expensive to run.
And rarely very handsome. But anyway,
Rarely...
that we need to,
they're just ordinary people like the rest of us. Yes. So but I think it's the exotic, romantic ideal or romantic idea of money is necessary, and there's this. At the time, there was this fashion for, well, Marie Antoinette previously, how romantic to live as a shepherdess in a little cottage and milk cows. But the reality, of course, was hard, backbreaking work, getting up at 5 o'clock in the morning, and it was probably the opposite of any romantic notion. So anyone like Jane Austen who was practical and saw the effect of having no money several times, and in fact draws a very worrisome picture of genteel poverty, like Miss Bates, knew having money is security. Having money is a roof over your head and food in your stomach, and is necessary. It's not romantic. It's the more money, the more insulation you have against genteel poverty.
So where Jane does differ from her society is she is very ironic and critical of actual titles. So all we need to do is look at the opening of Persuasion, and we see Sir Walter Elliot consulting, the baroness.
The peerage,
yeah, the peerage. This is his Bible, how he judges everybody, versus the new men of worth, which Anne Elliot sponsors, who are the people who are in the Navy, who are risking life and limb for the nation against Napoleon and his forces. And clearly Jane is on the side of the men of worth and valor. And so she actually is saying the ossified gentry, the ossified nobility and gentry, that system is not fit for purpose. You have to actually prove yourself for your character. So that's where she would differ from the first impression of immediately assuming that Lady Catherine de Bourgh or what's the Viscountess in
Lady Dalrymple.
That's it, Lady Dalrymple. She's a Viscountess. Yes,
Lady Dalrymple.
Actually, most of the people who do have a title of that nature in her books are pretty, they're pretty vacuous.
Creatures, aren't they, really? Well, they all have very strong opinions about how society ought to be run, but none of them, you suspect, if you dump them down and said earn your living, would have a clue about how to survive in normal society. And I think that's the stupidity, if you like, of the upper classes, was this absolute abhorrence of trade. You were frowned upon if you dared think about ways of earning money. It was, you inherit your money, or you marry money, or you live on credit, but God forbid you should actually earn some money. I think it almost got from having fought as not robber barons. No, that's wrong. Having fought of knights and barons initially getting grants of land and money from the king. Initially, they became very useless sort of people, almost the opposite of their ancestors, or basically clutching on and marrying each other to keep their wealth, but actually really frowning at anyone who dared. And I think it was out of fear, that the idea that somebody could earn enough money to climb up the social ladder. So they were closing ranks frantically to keep such people out, because I think they were very well aware of how inadequate they actually were deep down.
Well, and of course you got the French Revolution.
Of course, and that was a real fear.
Shock. Yeah,
that was a real fear. Yeah, and of course we dethroned our king, didn't we? We had our revolution earlier on where we got rid of King Charles.
Got it out of the system then.
Hopefully got it out of the system, but it could have come back, and that was a very real fear. So I think a lot of the putting down of the populace that occurred soon after the wars, or during the wars indeed, was about trying to stop the French Revolution happening here, which it could have done with food prices going up. We're seeing parallels, as we always do in history now. Food prices going up. The rich getting a lot richer of hard times. So all the oil companies recently have published record profits. Who would have thought that?
So one of the parallels there, it's a bit, we could do one on the cost of living crisis, actually, is that most of taxation came through
Yes.
tax on goods and customs.
Yeah.
So it was not a tax on income.
No.
Anyway, so
we divert.
Yes, that's a topic for another day. Just going back to, let's keep with Pride and Prejudice and first impressions. If you said to me, what is Jane, if I want to understand Jane Austen's novels, what are they about? I would say,
how long have you got?
No, there is, all of them at some level are about your first impressions and how they're wrong. It fits every single book.
Yes, you could say that.
So, and the worst thing you can be in Jane Austen's world is a hypocrite or a fake.
Yes.
So in Sense and Sensibility, it's somebody who is a sort of hypocrite, like
Willoughby.
Well, Willoughby, yes, but also the brother of
yes,
yeah.
the absolute the pinnacle of fakery or hypocrisy. Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
And you know, in case of Persuasion, I mean, I'm not going to do all the novels, but in the case of Persuasion, it's really Wentworth misunderstood Anne. You know, he left with the impression that she wasn't worth coming back for because she'd listened to advice from a
well-meaning family friend.
Yes, well, yeah. To come to value. So then learns the true value, comes back, learns her true value. So you could actually say it's all about first impressions proving wrong. And this is definitely the case of Pride and Prejudice, which is why it was the working title. Because if you think about it, the plot driver is, amongst the many things that happen, Elizabeth sees two men. One is Mr. Darcy, who seems proud, objectionable, snobbish, incredibly rich and handsome, but way, you know, just not interested in her, you know, all those things. And she sees Mr. Wickham, who seems sort of
very engaging, witty,
warm, and
very open. Mr. Wickham spills his life story at the drop of a hat, doesn't he?
Yeah, he's a victim.
So he's the exact opposite.
Yeah. And so he's able to sort of whisper the poison words in her ear and persuade her that Mr. Darcy did all these dastardly things. What
he does is he emphasizes and enhances. It's interesting. There's an algorithm, to bring a modern day parallel, on social media. If you look at a certain news story, it will give you more news stories in a similar vein. So what that does, it enhances your prejudices.
Yeah.
Leaves out contrary news stories or maybe unbiased news stories, and it keeps feeding you, like Mr. Wickham, more of the same prejudices. So what he does is actually just makes Lizzie feel great by saying, yes, you're so right, your impression is absolutely right, and here's something even worse about Mr. Darcy. So it reinforces her prejudices, and that's exactly what social media algorithms do as well, which I think is why we have so many trolls and so many people saying, you're either with us or against us. There is no way in between, because I'm absolutely right, and I know this because Wikipedia told me so, and so did all these algorithms. But actually, they think they're seeing the world around them in one vision, but actually they're seeing a very narrow vision of a story.
Yeah. So if you've got in a silo out there, make sure you read some kind of more reputable news source to get out of it. It
can be very comforting to have your first impressions reinforced, but is it reality? And I think the more unbiased or the more different opinions you can get, which, as Lizzie later finds out, she does start listening to other opinions than ones that reinforce hers. You can then get a much clearer picture, shall we say, of what's actually going on.
I think actually what you've done, Kate, is you've effortlessly brought us into thinking about Jane's applicability now, because I think it's exactly where it is, that her heroine goes on a journey from prejudice to knowledge. And she actually, and it's also, she judges, she discriminates. So she doesn't say, oh yes, he was always right about everything. So in the letter that he sends, there's two parts to it. One is, oh, Mr. Wickham is a bounder, which we all go, oh crikey, he's awful. We agree. But then the second part of the letter, is it that way around? Anyway, it's in two parts. The other part of the letter is about the behavior of the family at the ball and Jane.
Yes. So
Jane,
he's
the character,
justifying his behavior and his behavior to her. And she has to admit he has a kernel of justification.
Well, she's been embarrassed by her family too.
She's been embarrassed. Yeah, absolutely.
But she says he doesn't understand Jane.
Yes.
So his first impression of Jane, see what I'm doing there, is it's incorrect, that actually Jane is hiding her feelings because she's protecting herself and she's been taught to behave like that. And in fact, she's behaving exactly how Mr. Darcy behaves, but he doesn't recognize it in the female version of himself, which is a handsome woman who hides what she feels. So there is Lizzie isn't immediately leaping over to the other side saying, oh, I agree with everything Mr. Darcy says.
No, absolutely not.
She's sort of learning to actually make her own assessments. Yeah. And it's when Darcy actually really steps out. I mean, she's warming towards him, but when he steps out and actually does something which risks his own pride, and that is going to, get Wickham by the scruff of the neck and engineer the marriage with Lydia, where they're each other's punishment.
Yeah, I mean, that's very humbling for somebody like Mr. Darcy, because he's actually having to reward the person that nearly seduced his sister. So he must be absolutely fighting his own nature about that, but it's for a better good overall, in that he's saving essentially the Bennet family.
Because the other reactions you could have done at that point, and in fact, I think Mrs. Bennet mentions this in her hysterical way, which is, there could have been a duel.
Yes.
People did settle. It was illegal to fight duels, but people did it.
Yeah.
But
the consequences of fighting a duel,
and
in reality, the consequences of fighting a duel, as various people found out to their cost, was you create an enormous scandal.
Yeah, it wouldn't have solved the problem.
No, it would have made the problem worse.
You might have punished.
People who fought duels then fled abroad often, or had forced to go abroad, because the scandal was so great nobody would have accepted them in society anymore.
The only person who I know who sort of came through two duels and with a burnished reputation was Sheridan. He was challenged in about the 1780s, sometime around then, about the woman, this beautiful singer in Bath or Bristol, or that that sort of area where she was performing.
Yes.
And he was a suitor. The other suitor challenged him. They fought. Sheridan won. The guy wasn't satisfied. Challenged him again. They fought again. Sheridan was very badly wounded, but the lady stayed with Sheridan and married him. And then they lived unhappily ever after. Sadly, if this was a novel, they would all be. But unfortunately, that fell apart. But anyway,
Sheridan got away with it because he was part of the demi-monde, the society that was almost expected to be more flamboyant, being an actor.
I think because he was a hero,
and because he was very personable, people loved him as an actor. He was very witty. He was a little bit of a Mr. Wickham in terms of being very engaging, very witty. Everybody would like to have him at their parties. So I think there might have been a little bit of license given to him because of that, possibly.
But also, he wasn't the one who asked for the duel.
Well, that makes a difference as well. Yeah.
So it's Anyway, so as we've gone a little bit off into dueling. So, looking at our era, what do you think Jane would like about how we treat first impressions, and what she would dislike? So first impressions, things like swiping left or right on dating apps. What would she make of that?
I think she would approve that women have more choice about who they accept. I think she would have been utterly confused by the different roles that women had on social media. I mean, you've got everything from people demonstrating their professions, like women just showing off zoo animals in their with no makeup and lots of capabilities. And then you've got the TikTokers and influencers. I think she would have had a field day with influencers. Showing us how to make up our faces so that you're totally unrecognizable from your normal face. So I think it's a circus, really. It's the whole. Well, you get the impression that this is real life, but I think it's a very small. It's full of people who live their lives on social media and are actually don't know what to do with themselves if they're not on social media. So if you take their phones away, or if you took their computers away, do you think they would cease to exist?
Well, I think that if she was writing today, Caroline Bingley would be a influencer.
Definitely. Or would like to think herself an influencer anyway.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, that's the. I don't know if anyone's. I'm sure someone's done a rewriting recently, and they probably put her in that role. But that's what I think.
Well, they had Clueless, the movie, with Emma Woodhouse being an influencer of her social
yes,
circle.
yes. So I hope,
hopefully,
yeah. Though that funny to think that Clueless is already dated because
I know
pre-smartphone. Yeah, I think she would. I mean, her novels are caution us against first impressions, and I think she would be saying, beware.
Yes, absolutely.
You know, enter this fray with a great deal of irony and be clever about who you trust.
Yes, and as I think you've mentioned before, look at their actions, not their words.
Yeah.
Again, a lot of her books are around that, aren't they? What do people say and what do people actually do? And Frank Churchill is a classic one of that.
Yeah.
Coming along and being, again, very charming, very roguish. Everybody loves him. He's fun to be with. And then later on, sorry, spoilers, revealing himself to have basically been not living a lie, but certainly keeping a very important secret, and people understandably feeling betrayed by that.
And I think that's partly because he believes he's the hero of his own romance.
Yes, oh, definitely. He's totally selfish. And I think I've said that before, haven't I, about the difference between heroes and villains in Jane Austen. A lot of the villains, or certainly people she doesn't approve of, are utterly selfish and thinking only of their own needs, forget about everybody, how it affects everybody else.
So in this week, where we're celebrating the anniversary of the publication of Pride and Prejudice, we have had several, certainly in politics, both in the States and over here, problematic characters whose first impressions were not correct. Thinking of isn't there a member of Congress called George Santos who's lots of different names? I was reading
a little bit about him, and I think he's come out. He basically is a bit of a Walter Mitty type character, where he sort of said, "I went to this school. These are my sort of sterling credentials for being a man of the people. I worked at this office. I have this charity that I've set up for little furry animals." None of it was true. And then he said, "Oh, well, I just sort of said it wasn't quite true. That wasn't quite what I said." And sort of backpedal furiously when people actually bothered. Because I think a lot of people, especially on social media, rely on the fact that people don't do research anymore, or not. They rely so much on first impressions. That is the only impression. They're not going to do a second look at me. They're going to take me as I present myself. And indeed, a lot of people do. So I have, through bitter experience myself, and knee-jerk reactions to stories and clickbait, as they call it, started holding myself back from an emotional reaction to something and saying, why are they telling me this story? What's behind them making me feel this way? And it's very interesting psychologically how often first impressions are the only impressions people actually believe and want to believe. Even if you come back to someone and says, that story was total false and this is the true story, people will still believe the first story and not want to listen to the actual facts.
I noticed that he told quite a few of his lies on podcasts. So just want to say that we're not telling any lies this morning that I'm aware of.
Not that we're aware of, anyway.
No. Then also there's a chap over in the UK, Nadim Zahawi, who's a minister who's been in charge of tax policy and has been problematic about how he paid his taxes. So, I don't know what the
horror, Julia, shock horror.
I don't know what the truth of that story is, but anyway, it's been in the press. So, it's a case of she's ever relevant in telling us to be careful about our first impressions and to dig deeper and look at what people do. Do they pay their tax? Did they actually
what do they say and what
lead a volleyball team or whatever it was in the George Santos case?
Yes.
So moving to our Darcy and Wickham of the week, do you have I think I'm going to mention as my Wickham those two chaps we just talked about.
Decidedly.
They're in good company with Wickham. So what about a Darcy? Let's cheer us all up.
I think it's been a good week for US President Joe Biden. He's quashed Al-Qaeda and is hopefully passing an Inflation Reduction Act for the American people. But we will see.
Gosh, I'm unaware of all of this. Oh, well done. Okay, so
have you found somebody?
He's been your Mr. Darcy, has he? I think for me, my Mr. Darcy is it's a thing. It's like a not an individual.
Okay.
I mentioned that I've been doing local radio interviews because the third of my Jane Austen Investigates books called The Convict's Canal is now out, and it's based on first impressions. So if you're a listener and you want to live in Jane Austen's childhood for a bit and imagine the kind of people she might have met that inspired her later novels, plus get to grips with the historical background of her era, you might enjoy these books, or your kids might enjoy these books. Anyway, when I was doing the interviews, I thought I wanted to do a shout out for local radio.
Oh, yes.
Because I've been listening in to what's going on the radio beforehand, before I'm interviewed. And I've been thinking about how nice it is that there still exists these networks where you can hear about your very local news.
Which is often far more fascinating than anything national going on.
Because one of the reasons why you get a George Santos, sorry, George, I keep using you as an example, but is because people don't know each other. And we're now happily back in the assembly room in Meryton. If he'd walked in there, everyone would have known who he was and would have known he was lying. Local radio, for a certain extent, helps keep local politicians and local, if there's a local scandal, they will cover it.
Honest.
So we do need our local journalists on radio to keep our democracies healthy. So that's my Mr. Darcy.
Yes, I would totally agree with that.
Yeah.
I was just thinking Jane Austen was obviously influenced by Fanny Burney. And I was thinking about the title, First Impressions, as a working title for a book. You're an author. I'm sure you have lots of working titles for your novels. Totally change. Possibly your editor steps in and says, why not call it this? And you
they do.
But Pride and Prejudice is a much stronger title. First Impressions is kind of a little bit sort of wishy-washy and girly and that's nice. And then Pride and Prejudice sort of is much more a strong sounding title and more dramatic, isn't it? And interestingly, I think there's an idea that the title Pride and Prejudice came from this book Cecilia, written by Fanny Burney, as there's a sentence towards the end that says, remember, if to Pride and Prejudice you owe your miseries so wonderfully is good and evil balanced, that to Pride and Prejudice you will also owe their termination. And if you're a young Jane Austen, I think she would have been about 12 or 7 when that book first came out, riffling through her family's library. That would have obviously stuck in her memory, maybe for use later.
She was also, though, to be fair, she was also in a title pattern thing at that point, because you got Sense and Sensibility.
Yes, exactly.
Pride and Prejudice, who maybe Mansfield Park was supposed to be Constancy and something.
Arts and Gardens.
Yeah. So,
sorry,
do you have any Jane Austen news?
Do I have any? I have a little bit, yes. I also wanted to say, Julia, just as I've done the research on this, first impressions, how long do you think it takes to have a first impression of someone?
Oh, it's going to be a millisecond, like point seventh of a second or something.
About 7 seconds. About 7 seconds. I was looking on Psychology Today, as one does, riffling through the library of the internet, and they determine that it takes about 7 seconds for you to make a first impression of someone, and that first impression is very hard to budge then. And your first impression is often based on what you see, but also based on your societal biases. So interestingly, in Western society, we might make our first impressions on somebody's physique. Oh, he looks or she looks very strong. Obviously, we're influenced by beauty, and beauty is in the eye of the beholder, but I have observed myself that societally accepted beauty gets you more. People treat you better, people give you free stuff, people expect you to be a beautiful person inside as well as outside. But interestingly, they were saying that societies like China, so it's for Western societies, it's based on subtle facial vocal cues and obviously your physique. But somewhere like China, the way they form first impressions is based on your competence. So it's not so much your physique, it's your intelligence, their perception of your intelligence and your social standing. So Mr. Darcy would have done better in China than the UK, I think. So we're back to our news items. And Sanditon, love it or hate it, will premiere Sanditon Series 3, which will be the last series, they promise, will premiere on US network PBS. And I think it's also financed by Masterpiece Theatre and ITV. So, but what I liked about this is that a campaign when Sanditon was stopped dramatically after its first series, leaving us on a cliffhanger, a campaign called the Sanditon Sisterhood was created after the series was cancelled to campaign for its reinstatement. And it obviously worked because another company thought, oh, there's still a fan base there, we'll start it up again. But I just love the idea of a sisterhood working in the shadows like the Illuminati to get Sanditon back on our screens. In other good news, Bottom House in Hampshire has been awarded a prestigious award for its contributions to education in early women writers. So the 2022 Frances Garnham Award by Historic Houses was awarded not only for the preservation of Jane Austen's home and work, but for their excellent library and programme of educational events and exhibits. And if you ever had the chance, and I have, because I've been very lucky, to go to the Chawton House Library, it's fascinating and it is very accessible. Sometimes you have to ask to access it, but it's a really beautiful collection of books. And finally, Lethbridge Public Library Crossings Branch have created an Austen-themed escape room.
Oh, wonderful.
Incredibly successful, apparently. So the librarians have all got together their extensive Austen knowledge and created a Regency period challenge. And it's been such a success, they're doing some more themes next year, I think on Pokemon and Star Wars, for the name. Now, my instant thing on hearing this was, yes, I would love an Austen-themed escape room, but the main problem was I wouldn't want to escape it.
That's very profound.
There's a flaw there in that plan. I'd like to stay there going, oh, they did this. Oh, look at this. Oh, yes, they brought in this person.
That's lovely. And as you say, I like the fact that they started with Jane Austen. You know.
Of course. Always a good place to start, I find.
Thank you so much, Kate. And
pleasure as always, Julia.
And as ever, you made an excellent first impression and an equally good last impression.
Let's hope so. Right, I'm putting on my bonnet and going off for a walk where I will no doubt muddy my hems.
Okay. Bye-bye.